You know, I'm deeply disappointed that the theme song of this show was not Wheel and the Time Keeps on Turning by Journey. Just a complete missed opportunity there. But regardless, I hope you're all doing well because I'm here to review the first 3 episodes of the Wheel of Time series, the adaptation of Robert Jordan's famous fantasy series over on Amazon. This has been a long in the works series, and actually, I should say I wasn't actually anticipating reviewing this show. I figured it was something I was looking forward to. I was going to enjoy it and watch it, but I didn't think I was going to be mainly discussing it on this channel. But for 2 reasons, I've decided that I wanted to talk about it. One, I really liked this show. I really enjoyed these first 3 episodes, and we'll talk about my specific thoughts on that in just a second. So I kind of wanted to discuss it somewhere. And 2, when I went online after watching the episodes to like see some breakdowns, listen to some podcasts or something like that, as I do about a lot of the fantasy shows that I liked, I found that most of the people discussing the show, like Daniel Green, who's a YouTuber I really respect, we're all fans already of the Robert Jordan novels, and we're like giving these big backstories to the series. And I thought that I said, hey, as someone who has not read the novels, maybe it would be interesting to add my perspective into this discussion and to sort of discuss how this show is illuminating its lore and backstories and characters and revealing all of that stuff to someone like myself who has not read any of the novels. And believe me, I do want to read the novels at some point, but they're kind of a lot. Like, there are 1,000-page tomes, and there's like, I don't even know, there's 13 of those books, so I will get to them, but they're a lot, and I do plan on it. But I will say, I almost started them earlier. Just, this is a random story, but I just kind of want to share it. But I was going to debate between starting the Wheel of Time books or the Expanse novels, which I've also read and enjoyed, and was debating which one I wanted to choose. I hadn't read those books at the time, and I posted about it on Twitter asking which I should read, and Paul Stamets himself, Anthony Rapp, responded to my tweet saying that he hated the Wheel of Time books and that I shouldn't read them, and I'm like, well, someone from Star Trek told me not to read these books, so I guess that's my decision made. Look, I'm a Star Trek fan. I gotta do it. If they say read it or don't read it, I follow them. So I just thought that was a funny, weird story that was like, okay, I guess that's why I haven't read the Wheel of Time books. But I do plan on getting to them at some point, especially after enjoying the series. But let's dive into my review from the perspective of someone who's never read the books. I think the first thing that I should talk about as a non-fan of this book series is how the show delivered and drip-fed me lore and the building out of this world. I think that's what most people are going to be most interested in. I mean, this is a series with so many books, so clearly it's going to have a lot of backstory and lore. But what I enjoyed about these first 3 episodes is that it never felt like I was overwhelmed with too much information, and that I started to get some of the ideas and backstory and history of this world and universe on its own terms. And that it kind of like drip-fed me the lore, and it wasn't like a big exposition dump at any point where it's like, here's this exposition, here's this piece of backstory, we're gonna throw it at you. But as the characters themselves were discovering the world, we were able to discover it along with them. I think of specifically in the second episode, there's like a scene where the characters sing a song about this backstory history of the world, and it allowed Rosamund Pike's character, who is sort of like this witch woman who comes from this long line of sorcerers who are sort of like the matriarchal people in control, which we'll talk about that in just a second. She's allowed to like give a history of like this big war fought with the Dark Fiend, the Dark One, years ago, and these people that stood up to him and basically fought like a 300 like Spartan final showdown and never actually got help and fended them off for days, but eventually lost. But that was used as a moment for her character to connect with these kids and for her to like remind them of like just like have a humanizing moment between them. And I just enjoyed that these moments of exposition were humanizing, and that it didn't come of like huge specific moments, but just characters sort of naturally flowing in and out of the world. It was something that I think Game of Thrones did really, really well as well, that the series never gave us like a huge exposition dump, but just sort of like let us learn as we went through the world along the way, and there wasn't just like this big on high, like, here's the backstory, like you even get in something like the Lord of the Rings movies, which has that sort of really long exposition, which I still love those scenes, but it was sort of a big exposition dump here, and the show doesn't really do that at all, and I really like that. The other thing that I really enjoyed about the series so far, and it'll be interesting to see how it develops, I could see this being a really big positive or a negative for me, is its discussion of gender. This is something that I kind of knew before I entered the show, is that like gender plays a really interesting role throughout this series, specifically that we learn that this world is a somewhat matriarchal world, where we have the Rosamund Pike's character belongs to a group of essentially sorcerers who can control wind, but they're all women, and any men who are seen using this power are considered dirty, as if they're filthing it up, and often killed. And even in like villages, while there seems to be, at least as I can tell in the first episode of the show, as we sort of entered it into this two rivers city, or little small out town up in the mountains, is that like men and women are fairly equal in the society. It seems fairly normal, but there is sort of like a mysterious mystique and possibly ostracizing of men in the society, and that women have a little bit more ceremony and maybe even a little bit more power in society. Maybe not. It was a little bit unclear how like the matriarchal society works in the within like everyday society, because there's like men owning the shops and things like that. I didn't get like a huge sense of sexism, but there was also like a women's only ceremony at one point in there. So I'm honestly curious to see how this show will develop that theme of gender, whether this is a full matriarchal society, or if only like the witches of this series, if they are just the only matriarchal sort of power here, and they just happen to be some of the most powerful here. What I also enjoyed here is we're starting to learn a little bit more about the factions throughout this universe as well. We get as I've been mentioning, the Rosamund Pike's character, the Aes Sedai, I believe is how you say their name. They clearly are not particularly well loved throughout the land. I mean, obviously they're the most powerful, but they're often looked upon with contempt. They're a bit elitist as well. We get a really interesting story from one of our characters where we learned that a woman who had developed this power walked for days to try and get to their tower in order to learn from them, but because she was seen as a peasant, she was quickly turned away. And so there's definitely this classism within them. But we also get these gold cloaks in the episode 2, which also seem really, really dark. They seem to be, from what I gathered, people who don't really love any type of magic whatsoever, whether it be the Dark One or the Aes Sedai. And I really loved, they had a particular villain character, one of the questioners in the opening sequence, that was just clearly set up as like this vile dude. And just very much like he's the type of villain that I like, that just like, he's very like put together, but he likes to like control the stage and be like at the center of everything, and kind of like gets right in people's faces. I just really enjoyed the villain of our the questioner with the this, I think it's called the White Cloaks was their name. And so I'm liking the development of these different factions throughout here as well. Now, the other thing that I really loved about the show too was the performances. Everyone in this series is spot on. Rosamund Pike, I think, kind of plays the kind of Gandalf figure, but she does have a little bit of an edge to her beyond Gandalf. And so I kind of like the sort of like darker leader type that's sort of aloof and distant, but just doesn't really seem to care, may only be there for her own needs rather than actually caring about anyone. And so I like that sort of aloofness of her character, and Rosamund Pike plays it super well. We also have the character of Rand, played by, I believe, Joshua Strandowski, who I think was recast for season 2, which is deeply disappointing because he is truly excellent. He has that sort of like dour boy, like, oh, I have the weight of the world on my shoulders, I'm kind of meh, but he's not so down that like mopey kind of path at certain points where I feel like I understand where he's coming from a lot of the time. Like he's hurt by the fact that his girlfriend Gwendolyn is kind of choosing to not pursue a life with him, but pursue her own like power and needs, which means that she won't be able to marry at any point. And he's kind of like bitter about that, but understanding. And I like that nuance there, that he is a little bit of a dour boy, but he's not someone who's so much of a jerk that he can't understand and let someone else live their own life. And so I thought that was like an interesting dynamic that you usually don't see between men and women characters, especially in fantasy settings like this, but really in any fiction. We also get Matt and Perrin as well as part of the group as well, and both of them I think are really fantastically laid. Matt is like this kind of like thief character, kind of a little bit of a, the roguish type of guy, but they give him a lot of really good character by showing that he cares for his sisters and take care of his sisters, despite his father being kind of an asshole who doesn't really pay much attention to the family, and his mother who is kind of a drunk because of the father. And so I just really like that they were able to humanize this roguish type of character. He could have easily just been a one-note like rogue, but which I always like my rogues, don't get me wrong, love the rogues, but he is given a little bit more depth to him right up front. Perrin I also really liked as well. He's sort of like the bigger, like stronger guy who seems to be like have a little bit more emotion and kind of wear his heart on his sleeve throughout the series, at least in these first 3 episodes. And I liked what we saw of him. He is a little bit relegated in these first 3 episodes to kind of being like a mopey meh guy, like, because he does, spoiler at the end for episode 1, he does accidentally kill his wife, and that sort of like gives a lot of trauma, very obviously, and so he manages to make himself feel human even amongst the sort of like sadness and trauma and grief that he's dealing with and all the craziness going on that's in these first 3 episodes. And so while I don't think the actor has had a lot to do just yet, I do think that he's portrayed fairly well, and I'm curious to see more of him. I think Gwendolyn, though, is probably my standout performance of this. I think she is truly, truly fantastic. I really love the actress's performance of her. She definitely has this like anger about how she's been treated by the just society and the world, and yet she also has a warmth that she shares with other characters, and so she's able to oscillate between this like fascination with the world, her relationship with all these different characters, as well as her curiosity and also hesitance with her own powers. And I thought that that was such a great dynamic that this actress was able to portray really, 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 really well. There's also a ton of other stuff going on in this like initial episode. Like we have Peyton, who seems to be a merchant, but I got little vibes, especially when the main town was attacked at the end of the first episode, that he might have a little bit more to him than just being like a interesting merchant, because he seems to have been able to escape the Trollocs, these like orc-like kind of creatures that have the face of a boar attacking. He was able to escape them pretty easily. One last thing I should say about the craft of the show before I talk a little bit more about the plot of it is that I think everything looks fantastic here. I think the costumes, the like overall look of the series, it definitely has that sort of grand high budget feel that, you know, like Amazon's putting Amazon money into this. And I really just liked seeing all of that. I think the only thing that I was disappointed on in terms of the look of the series was I did not like the CGI at all. Like, really at all. The Trollocs, the orc-like things that I mentioned, they did not look great in my opinion. I liked the design of them. It wasn't particularly unique. I've seen similar designs like this before, but the CGI just made them feel like a little bit out of place within this world. They didn't feel like dirty and like part of the world that you saw in like Lord of the Rings with their orcs. Like, I just like the practical effects of the orcs in those movies, and maybe I'm a bit spoiled because because they did everything practically, they just looked real. And the CGI here, just these monsters, while intimidating and very well done for the most part, they still just did not feel a part of the world. And I also feel like the other major CGI that we see is like the power that Rosamund Pike's character uses, the wind controlling this, and it just kind of looks kind of bland to me. There's moments where it has its beauty, like when she's just murdering all the Trollocs in episode 1, but overall it's just like whispers of in the air. And I understand that if the power is like wind-based power, it's kind of hard to show that in an intriguing way visually as compared to like other powers, but for me it just was sort of like meh. It kind of looked a bit weird, and I could definitely tell it was CGI. Did not feel as part of this world in a realistic sense. And so I think the weakest part of the craft of this show is definitely the CGI. Overall, everything else works for me. But then this brings me to the plot of the series. The basic kind of idea of this plot of the series, at least from what I can glean so far, is that there is a kind of a chosen one character, the dragon, who gets reborn every few years, who takes on the Dark One. The Dark One is now currently rising again. And there's sort of this wheel of time, this cycle of things being born and reborn, and things happening over and over and over again, kind of Battlestar Galactica, all this has happened before, all this will happen again sort of thing. And so Rosamund Pike character, because the Dark One is gaining power, is looking for the reborn dragon. And we have our 4 main characters, Gwendolyn, Matt, Rand, and I'm trying to remember them all, and Perrin, all might possibly be the Dragon Reborn because they were all born around the same time, and they all have a similar access to this power. And so she wants to try and figure out who it is, but ultimately the Dark One attacks, and so the kids have to go with her in order to protect their village from being attacked again because the Dark One's after them. And then from there we start to develop and learn more about the world as these 3 go through their journeys, and they eventually even get split up towards the end of the 3rd episode for interesting reasons. And I think that this setup feels very kind of standard to me so far. I think that the plot of this, at least again, I know this goes on for 13 books or whatever, it feels to me to be the weakest element of it in terms of telling and doing something unique with this story. I mean, I've seen, not that this is better, like I think Aragon is not as well written, but Aragon has a very similar feel to it. Star Wars has a very similar feel to it, right? Like kids going off with a mentor and being put into a chosen one journey. And so I feel like from just these 3 episodes so far, and maybe it'll be complicated. I know that there's something kind of similar to Dune. Again, this is just me knowing a little bit outside the books, from the books without having read them, but that there's a little bit of a Chosen One, like breaking down the Chosen One idea that you see in like Dune as well. So I think that if that is the case, that I think that's interesting. The one thing I will say is the fact that 4 characters possibly might be this Chosen One is also what intrigues me. I'm curious to see how they're going to maybe want the power, maybe not want the power, maybe want the title, maybe not want the title. Also how gender is going to play into that as well, as we clearly see gender being a big theme throughout this. I think also the other thing too, speaking of gender, it kind of brought me up to a little bit of like, there's a little bit of like the teenage angst creeping into episode 2, that worked and didn't work for me at certain points throughout that episode, where we have our characters kind of being like, oh, should we be trusting Rosamund Pike's character, should we not, and some characters trusting her or not. And there were moments in there that I felt were a little bit forced to just get characters to yell. I think particularly Rand felt a little bit like disingenuous to Gwendolyn at certain points, like, oh, you sided with her already? And it was just like one scene, and it just felt like he was a little bit too quick to judge, and I understand the scene is heightened and it kind of worked for me, and it didn't stick around for too long, and resolved it, which made me feel happy that this wasn't going to go into CW teen drama territory. But I did think that was a little bit forced in the second episode, that made it a little bit weaker for me. But ultimately, I still was very up on their relationships as a whole. But to kind of wind down this review, I think the things that were strongest to me, though, were the themes of this work as they're related to the characters. As I said, there's already stuff about gender being brought up here, and how gender relates to power, and men and women and their dynamics with each other are just like playing into these social dynamics of these characters. I think that's super interesting. This idea of secular time is one that's also really always resonated with me, that things are recurring over and over and over again. We see that throughout human history. The same battles that we fought years ago are sometimes the same battles that we fight today, and I like exploring that theme quite a bit in fiction. And I like the idea that the Dark One, as we kind of get hints of in episode 3, that the Dark One may not be completely evil. I mean, obviously he has like Trollocs and evil monsters and guys like that, which by the way, the monster with like the Sarlacc pit mouth sort of guy, he looked really cool. I liked that, I think is like a dark fiend or something like that. Anyways, looked cool. But I also like the idea that there were some people that are on the side of the Dark One because he can break this cycle. That the dragon is someone who might be upholding this cycle, and the Dark One is someone who just wants to break the wheel, as to steal from Game of Thrones a little bit, like break the wheel of this cycle. And so I liked that idea of maybe the Dark One may not be completely bad, but maybe using evil power in order to just break this wheel, because we constantly go in through the same cycles over and over and over again. And I liked that idea and the thematics here. So I think the strongest thing here are the characters, the relationships to each other, the themes, and the world that is being built here slowly but surely, as well as the craft and the performances. This are top notch. Where I think for me at this moment, I know some people will probably be upset at me considering that this is a whole book series, but I think the plot as it stands feels a bit stereotypical at the moment, and I'm curious to see how it's going to develop as we go through. I think the final thing too that I wish to address for this review is a lot of people are saying like this could be the new Game of Thrones. And it might be. It quite possibly could be. Amazon's certainly putting Game of Thrones money behind it. I'm a little bit cautious to hype it that much. I don't think it's on that level. Last season of Game of Thrones aside, what I liked a lot about Game of Thrones and why I think it became this phenomenon to me was it was something fresh and new. We hadn't really seen a fantasy series done on that level on television before. And then also, I feel like a lot of it was the political intrigue and like the vast, like, different sides. You can get into like, do you agree with these people? Do you agree with these people? That you could sort of delve into. That it was so sprawling of a narrative. Hence why you had the opening of Game of Thrones being like the giant map, because it was so sprawling. And this show feels a little bit more limited in scope when we were only focusing on 4 characters. And yes, they kind of get split off at certain points, but it feels a little bit limited at the moment. And I'm curious to see how that explodes out and how we learn more about the political world of this universe, and if that will sort of be the same hook as we had with Game of Thrones. I'm curious about that, but at the moment it doesn't feel like it has that sprawling nature. And then the second thing that I kind of alluded to here was Game of Thrones felt fresh. And right now, everyone and their uncle is trying to have a big fantasy series like Game of Thrones. I mean, we have Wheel of Time. We have even on Amazon, we have the Lord of the Rings show that they're planning on doing to follow that up. Netflix has The Witcher, and they're doing like 20 spin-offs of The Witcher, a kid show with The Witcher, which I don't even know what that's going to even be. I don't even know how you do a kid show with The Witcher. They also have like the Crows show, and there's a bunch more of fantasy series like this. And so I feel like we're kind of getting inundated with fantasy at the moment. And so I feel like this show has the possibility to be like qualitatively on that level, but I don't think it's going to be that phenomenon that everyone is going to be talking about, like Game of Thrones was. For that reason, it's not as fresh as I feel Game of Thrones felt like. Whether or not you think Wheel of Time or Game of Thrones is the better series at the end of the day, books or TV show, Game of Thrones came at this particular moment that made it feel fresh in that way. And this show, while I like it so far, and that's why I want to review and talk about it, and I'm excited to learn more about this series and possibly dive into the books, I don't think it's going to be on that level. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think it's really going to hit that sort of cultural consciousness that I think Amazon wants, because they're chasing the bear, chasing the dragon, whatever the metaphor is. And I think that the next Game of Thrones, or the next MCU or whatever, is going to be something that just feels different and fresh, at least at the time that it comes up. And I don't think it's going to be another big fantasy series, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. That's sort of my end thoughts on that. So at the end of the day, that's my thoughts on the Wheel of Time first 3 episodes. Depending on how this video does, I may do episode reviews. Most definitely I will do a season-long review. At the end of the season, I'll sit down and I'll do a review of the entire season and my thoughts on it. If this review does gangbusters, maybe I'll do episode by episode one, so let me know if you want that. But I'll definitely probably do a season-long review at the end of all of this. So that's my thoughts on Wheel of Time episodes 1 through 3. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you aren't a fan of the books or haven't read the books, or if you are a fan of the books. Let me know your perspective on what you thought of my thoughts of this show having no real hook in to what this series is prior to seeing the show, or at least little bits and pieces that I know. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Oh, don't forget to subscribe and all that fun stuff. Now live long and prosper. I appreciate you. Mwah.